I was going to make this video about the timeline of the coronavirus outbreak in China, and as part of that I tracked down an internet rumor that the virus started in a Wuhan lab. But that rumor has suddenly become front-page news. So I'll cut the video short and just focus on that. I'll leave the rest for another day.
There is a growing belief that the COVID-19 virus originated in the Wuhan lab.
An intern was infected, who later infected her boyfriend, and then went to the wet market in Wuhan, where it began to spread.
So, who is this female intern working in a Wuhan lab who got infected? Before all this blew up in the mainstream media, weeks ago I was already following it up, prompted by a post on the forum of my last video. They knew as early as October 18th, 2019 that this virus had leaked, and that's the day it leaked out of the Wuhan Level 4 biolab. Unfortunately, the poster didn't give a source, but other believers in the lab leak claim do.
For a start, a scholar from the South China University of Technology recently published a paper.
Actually, it wasn't so much a published paper as something he wrote and shared on a science forum. It was posted on 23 different websites around the world and then spread around the blogosphere. The author's name is Xiao Botao. But this commentator got his information from a video called I Found the Source of the Coronavirus by a YouTuber called LaoY86. And I tracked a lot of the Wuhan lab escape rumors back to the same video, which got over 2 million hits. Now, spoiler alert, LaoY86, real name Matthew Tai, hasn't actually found the source of the coronavirus. But he does outline a theory that's been bouncing around the Chinese blogosphere for weeks, and he gives a very comprehensive account of all the evidence. I'll pick out the bits of his video that give the gist of the story.
Xiao Botao, he was a professor, he posted a thesis. The professor directly pointed out that the main source of the virus is from the Wuhan lab, which is only 300, or actually 280 meters to be exact, from the Huanan seafood market. He also gives a clear timeline and has information that researchers were splashed with urine and blood samples from all the bats that were collected. People working in the lab claim to have been splashed with coronavirus-containing vials. Huang Yanling was a researcher in the lab working on the virology of bats with Shizheng Li, and she's missing. Most people believe her to be patient 0, and most people believe she's dead. And her online presence has been scrubbed from existence, all happening in a lab 280 meters away from the Huanan seafood market. The December 24th posting acknowledges that they've made a big discovery in human transmissibility, and they need more help to deal with it.
I hope you all followed that. If not, here's a summary of the theory. It all sounds very well researched and very convincing. But of course it needs to be fact-checked, and the way we do that is to ask two basic questions. What's the evidence, and what are the sources for this evidence? There are three main lines, starting with the aforementioned Xiao Botao.
He knew researchers at the lab that were infected.
Correction, he didn't know any researchers at the lab. This is where it pays to check by reading the source, Xiao Botao's internet post, which I'm showing you on the screen. He didn't even know the lab. He said he discovered the 2 labs in Wuhan, not one, by doing a search on the internet. One is the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention, just 280 meters from the Wuhan seafood market, where the virus was thought to have spread. The other is the Wuhan Institute of Virology, about 12 kilometers away.
The professor directly pointed out that the main source of the virus is from the Wuhan lab.
Okay, but which one?
Which is only 300, or actually 280 meters to be exact, from the Huanan seafood market.
So Matthew Tai is referring to the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which we'll call the Wuhan CDC. That's the one 280 meters from the Wuhan seafood market, and the one he shows on the map.
He also gives a clear timeline and has information that researchers were splashed with urine and blood samples from all the bats that were collected.
No, Xiao Botao says one researcher, with the initials JHT, was splashed with bat blood and urine on different occasions, while he was collecting samples in caves nowhere near the Wuhan CDC, which is the institute he worked for. The timeline is not clear, but as we'll see from Xiao Botao's 2017 source, this happened several years before the novel coronavirus outbreak.
and they had already begun self-quarantine after they showed symptoms of being infected.
No, again, there's no they. This was one person, far from the lab, and he showed no symptoms of being infected. All this is spelled out in Xiao Botao's post, which Matthew Tai is supposed to be quoting. But, I hear you say, it says on Matthew Tai's screen that the researchers at the Wuhan virus laboratory were splashed with bat blood and urine. It says so right there. But what Matthew Tai's video is showing you on the screen, for some reason, is not Xiao Botao's post, but a translated report from Radio France Internationale. It comes from their Hong Kong correspondent, and as we'll see, it's ridiculously inaccurate.
The professor directly pointed out that the main source of the virus is from the Wuhan lab.
No, Xiao doesn't say that at all. He only says it's possible, and plausible, and probable. These are three different things, so take your pick, but nowhere does it say that the main source of the virus was the Wuhan CDC or any other research facility. But that's what Matthew Tai and his followers now believe, so let's figure out how this story got so terribly mangled and embellished in its many retellings. Xiao Botao's information about researcher JHT and the bat blood and bat pee comes, he tells us, from a couple of media reports. He only gives an English translation of the titles, the first of which is by a reporter called Tao, initial P. Based on that, I tracked down an article with a similar title in Chinese by a reporter called Tao Pan, featuring a bat researcher called Tian Junhua. If his family name is placed last, as in Western tradition, that gives the initials JHT. The story tells of how on different occasions blood, and on one occasion urine, had splashed on him while he was out collecting bats in the wild, and that he had isolated himself for 14 days because of the risk of infection. However, the article makes clear he was never infected. The timeline for these incidents is after 2012, when he started collecting bats, and before 2017, when the article was published. This is the researcher in question, Tian Junhua, filmed for a documentary about his research. And Xiao Botao seems to have accurately relayed what Tao Pan reported, just leaving out the dates. The Radio France Internationale reporter then seems to have mangled these different elements of Xiao Botao's post and embellished them. He turns a single researcher into several. He merges the separate incidents of bat blood and bat urine into a single incident, and then he moves the scene of the action from the caves of Hubei province into something called the Wuhan Virology Lab. But there's no such place, of course. He's conflated two separate institutes into one. Matthew Tai then adds an embellishment of his own. Instead of these non-existent lab workers not being infected, he claims they were infected. As I said, over 2 million people have seen this video, and of course lots of bloggers and commentators have copied Matthew Tai's version of Radio France's version of Xiao Botao's version of Tao Pan's version of the story. Okay, so let's look at Matthew Tai's second piece of evidence.
During my research, a name kept popping up. Huang Yanling.
If research means simply Googling keywords like Wuhan, bat, and patient zero, and reading blogs, chat rooms, Twitter, and its Chinese equivalent Weibo, then it's not surprising that Huang Yanling's name keeps popping up, because she's been the focus of a conspiracy theory circulated in China since early February. So, who is she?
Huang Yanling was a researcher in the lab working on the virology of bats with Shi Zhengli.
Well, she wasn't any of those things. First of all, Matthew Tai told us that the lab he's referring to is the Wuhan CDC, 280 meters from the seafood market. But Huang Yanling didn't work there. She worked at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is 12 kilometers away on the other side of the Yangtze River. And she didn't work on the virology of bats. All of her published research is involved with finding a cure for the bacterial infections Streptococcus and methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. She was investigating the pathway by which these bacteria could be destroyed by viruses, nothing to do with bats at all.
And she's missing. Most people believe her to be patient zero, and most people believe she's dead.
Well, certainly a lot of people copying and pasting this rumor believe that. But popular belief isn't evidence. So what started all these rumors? Well, in February, when the virus outbreak was at its peak in China, someone went onto the website of the Wuhan Institute of Virology and noticed that there was no photo or bio of one of its ex-students. This is China, where questions tend to be quickly followed by conjecture. Where's the photo? If there's no photo, then she must be missing, and if she's missing, she must be dead, and if she's dead, she must have been involved in bat research and died from the new coronavirus. And if she caught the new coronavirus, then she must be patient zero. The story spread across China and was then popularized in the West by Matthew Tai.
Most believe that her body was quickly cremated and the people working at the crematorium were perhaps infected.
Now that could be true. It is possible most people who are copying and pasting this rumor do believe her body was cremated and that the cremation crew got infected. Others believe she spread it through her boyfriend. But again, popular belief is not evidence. The most convincing evidence that she might be missing is that the government hasn't dispelled these rumors by finding her. But the sad fact is that people go missing all the time in China, and it's not because they all contracted COVID-19. We're dealing with a country that practices arbitrary arrest, and where the slightest criticism of the government can lead to arrest or detention or even imprisonment. It can lead to being fired from your job and relocated, effectively banished, to another part of the country.
And if Huang Yanling is truly alive like they claim, why is her photo and bio removed?
I honestly have no idea, Matthew. And what would be the point in doing that anyway, especially if her name and her graduation details are still there? She may be missing. She may not be missing. She may have got run over by a bus. She could be one of many people detained in China for political reasons. She could be living happily in Chengdu and doesn't particularly want all this attention. I don't know. You don't know, and the millions of people speculating about this don't know either. We can't just jump to the conclusion that she must be patient zero because YouTubers, bloggers and chat room posters believe it. Matthew Tai's third line of evidence is a job posting on the Wuhan Institute of Virology website. I'll let him tell you what it says, then I'll show you what it really says.
Which basically says, we've discovered a new and terrible virus and would like to recruit people to come deal with it. The December 24th posting acknowledges that they've made a big discovery in human transmissibility and they need more help to deal with it.
Okay, so it doesn't say any of that. Matthew's showing you a translation of only part of the text he showed in Chinese. He's left all this out. And this missing translation is the part that supposedly says the team has discovered a terrible new virus. In fact, it doesn't say that at all. It says the team is engaged in long-term research that's been published in 110 papers and has identified a large number of new viruses in bats and rodents. So these new viruses haven't just been discovered. The term is referring to discoveries made over the last 10 years, and none of them is described as terrible. Research into bats as carriers of coronavirus is taking place all over the world, from South Africa to Germany, Kenya, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and of course the United States. Why? Because these bats are known to be the source of coronavirus infection. And all these research institutes also advertise for researchers. You don't need to take my word for all this. I put all of these sources and links in the video description so you can check them. The theory that a female intern at a Wuhan lab got infected and then spread the virus is not new. It goes back several months, but its origins are unsubstantiated rumors on the Chinese language internet, embellished by bloggers, vloggers and news outlets on the English language internet, based on misreadings, mix-ups and mistranslations. That's why everyone, especially mainstream media reporters, need to fact-check this stuff before believing it. But the idea that the virus leaked from a lab is just too good a story to let go. So bloggers and journalists are conjuring up all kinds of new evidence, like a photo taken supposedly recently inside the secretive Wuhan Institute of Virology, supposedly showing a broken seal on a fridge containing the SARS-CoV-2 virus. In fact, it was taken 2 years ago and posted on the Wuhan Institute of Virology's own website, and it's still there, along with other photos that the newspapers missed. So there were no SARS-CoV-2 virus samples in the freezer, and all the virus samples that were there are held in sealed containers frozen to minus 23 degrees centigrade. Okay, how about this?
So when she heard about the outbreak of the new virus, she was worried that it could have come from her lab. She spoke about the sleepless nights she suffered worrying whether it was her lab that was responsible for the outbreak.
Which is understandable. After all, it's possible someone might have come into contact with bat samples and not noticed. According to the Washington Post, officials from the US Embassy in Beijing visited the Wuhan Institute of Virology a few years ago and were concerned about safety standards there. According to the Post, the Chinese researchers at WIV were receiving assistance from the Galveston National Laboratory, but the Chinese requested additional help. The cables argued that the United States should give the Wuhan lab further support, mainly because its research on bat coronaviruses was important but also dangerous. But after gene sequencing, it turned out that the new virus was not among the viruses collected from samples taken in the wild. So is it possible it came from a virus the lab possessed that was similar? That's the claim of a tabloid newspaper, now being read out by this YouTuber.
One of the virus samples she had in the laboratory had a 96% genetic match to COVID-19.
What they mean is that it had a 96% genetic match to SARS-CoV-2. COVID-19 is the disease, not the virus. The newspaper is referring to RATG13, a naturally occurring virus that the researchers sampled from a bat in Yunnan province. But 96% doesn't make this the same virus. After all, we humans share 96% of our DNA with chimpanzees. One research team may have found a much better match, 99%, with a virus found in pangolins. But I can't cite that definitively because the research hasn't been published yet. Another popular theory is that the virus was deliberately bioengineered in an effort to study bat viruses and then accidentally escaped from the lab. The favourite piece of evidence for this theory is, supposedly, a 2017 article in Nature. Researchers created a chimeric virus made up of surface protein SHC014. All right, you read it.
And the backbone of a SARS virus that had been adapted to grow mice and to mimic human disease. Kill them. You'll notice the March editor's note on this because this appears to be obviously related to the question of was this created in a lab? They say, we are aware this story is being used as a basis for unverified theories that the novel coronavirus causing COVID-19 was engineered. There's no evidence this is true. Scientists believe that an animal is the most likely source of the coronavirus. Well, ultimately, that would still be the same, even if it was engineered, would it not?
No, it would not. Making assumptions like this, based on a failure to understand the difference between a lab-made virus and one that comes from an animal, is exactly why Nature warned you not to use the paper as the basis for unverified theories. And after reading that warning out loud, you come straight out with an unverified theory. Natural viruses and lab-engineered viruses are completely different. Because when researchers are bioengineering a virus, they usually don't build the entire thing from scratch. What they're interested in is the business end of the virus, called the spike proteins. They house the receptor binding domain, the RBD, where the virus attaches itself to the host cell, and the cleavage sites, where it breaks in and enters the cell. So except in exceptional circumstances, they build the spike proteins onto the structure of an existing infectious virus. I suppose the best analogy is graffiti artists. They usually don't spend lots of time and money building an entire wall from scratch in order to spray paint their art. They find an existing wall and use that. When researchers at the Scripps Institute examined the genetic makeup of the new coronavirus, they discovered that the whole thing was new. Not only that, there was clear evidence that the virus had evolved. It had genetic sequences that could only be obtained in the presence of a complete immune system. Battle scars, if you like, showing that it had been forced to evolve by adapting and trying to overcome immune responses. You don't get that by artificially growing a virus in the presence of isolated cells. The Scripps Institute researchers published their findings in Nature Medicine with the clear conclusion that it wasn't a laboratory construct. One of the researchers told Science Daily, "These two features of the virus, the mutations in the RBD portion of the spike protein and its distinct backbone, rules out laboratory manipulation as a potential origin for SARS-CoV-2. The fact that this virus wasn't engineered rules out another rumour in the English-language blogosphere that it was a bioweapon developed by the Chinese, and the rumour on the Chinese blogosphere that it was bioengineered by the US Army. Analysis of the virus has ruled that out. The Australian tabloid this YouTuber and many others are copying from claims it got all its information from a leaked dossier compiled by governments, but it won't show it or tell us who wrote it. A secret leaked dossier does sound more reliable than bloggers, YouTubers and tabloid newspapers, but it doesn't contain a single piece of information that couldn't have been found on the internet with a simple Google search. The information about a 96% match, for example, comes from a Nature paper by Chinese researchers, including Shi Junli, published in February. The fact that the authors of the supposed dossier thought COVID-19 as a virus says a lot about their expertise and the extent of their research. And the information about a chimeric virus built in a laboratory is hardly secret. It comes from this February paper in Nature. The quotes about Shi Junli worrying that the virus might have come from her laboratory were published in April in Scientific American, etc., etc. No need for the Telegraph to invoke a leaked dossier. All this could have been just as easily written by an intern trawling through the internet and copying and pasting publicly available information. But as researcher Peter Darshak says,
let's look at the balance of probability. That's what you have to do.
That's because there's another laboratory in China which is a much more likely source of the infection. Unlike the Wuhan Institute of Virology or the Wuhan CDC, which have just a few researchers handling bat samples using safety equipment and protocols, this secretive laboratory outside Wuhan employs thousands of researchers. It's never been inspected by anyone outside of China, and yet it has a much lower level of biosecurity than both of the other labs. Safety equipment here is completely absent, and there have been numerous cases of researchers coming into contact with bat blood and bat urine. I'm sure you'd agree that this laboratory is a much more likely source of infection. Now that I've got the attention of the lab leak believers, the place I'm talking about isn't actually a laboratory. It's the countryside, and the researchers are actually just Chinese farmers and villagers who venture into the woods and caves around Wuhan, trapping bats for food and digging bat guano for fertilizer.
People live out in rural areas close to bat caves. They're exposed every night when bats fly over them, urinate, defecate, maybe onto their food or into their drink. And people go into bat caves. People go in for various reasons. They're going to dig out the bat guano, the feces, and they use it as a fertilizer, just like we used to do many years ago with bird feces. They go into caves to shelter from the rain. They're farmers. They're subsistence farmers hunting and eating wildlife, so they get exposed that way.
Even tourists visit caves crowded with bats and infested with bat urine and feces. So if the virus made the direct jump from bats to humans, these places where thousands of unprotected people come into contact with bats and don't isolate themselves are a much more likely source of infection. So why don't tabloid newspapers write stories about this? For the same reason I had to call it a laboratory, to get people's attention. Secret labs full of reckless scientists and dangerous experiments releasing deadly viruses make headlines and sell newspapers. Peasant farmers collecting bat shit in caves. Well, you can see why people prefer the lab story. But all that assumes the virus jumped from bats directly to humans in the first place. Although bats are probably the reservoir for the virus, most researchers don't think they passed it directly on to humans. According to DNA analysis, SARS-CoV-2 first evolved around 50 years ago in bats, and then most likely spread to humans through an intermediate species. That was how previous viruses have spread, SARS through civets and MERS through camels. A likely pathway for SARS-CoV-2 was through pangolins. It's the world's most trafficked mammal, highly prized in China for food, as well as having its scales used for traditional medicine. As I mentioned earlier, one so far unpublished study found a virus in pangolins that shared 99% of its DNA with SARS-CoV-2. So what has the Wuhan seafood market got to do with all this? Well, very early on it was clear that many patients coming into Wuhan hospitals with pneumonia-like conditions had a connection to the market. A paper in The Lancet, a British medical journal, confirmed this. It's possible it came to the market from outside and spread there simply because it's the kind of place where crowds of people come together, but it's also possible the virus started there. Not by bats, which weren't sold at the market, but through other animals sold there. Epidemiologists and virologists have been warning for years that these wild animal sales, where exotic species are brought together, often alive in closely packed cages, are a breeding ground for new viruses. They've been calling for the Chinese government to shut them down and stamp out the trade. That's where the attention needs to be focused, and that's why the Chinese government needs to be held accountable. It's always easier to blame scientists because that makes for a better story and a more juicy conspiracy. Most people don't understand science, and they don't read any of the published research that comes from these institutes, so it's easy to convince them that these places are secretive and mysterious. It not only sells newspapers, it sells T-shirts.